Hello, my name is Andrew Peacock. I'm currently Professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic History at the University of St Andrews in the UK, and I'm delighted to be joining ANAMED in New Year as a Senior Research Fellow to work on my project Court Culture and Intellectual Life in Seljuk Anatolia. Um, Broadly speaking, my field of research is the history, and in particular intellectual history, of the medieval Islamic world, and Anatolia in particular, drawing on Arabic, Persian, and Turkish sources. Um, my concentration in particular is on the early period of the Muslim presence in Anatolia in the wake of the Seljuk invasions of the 11th century. Now, the period of the 11th to the 13th centuries are widely recognized as forming a critical period in the transformation of Anatolia from a Greek-speaking, overwhelmingly Christian land, as it had been under Byzantium, to one where the Muslim faith and the Turkish language predominated. And it's in this period that the term Turkey starts to be applied to Anatolia by outsiders for the first time, whilst the physical environment of the towns and countryside was transformed through the building of mosques and caravanserais. The leading dynasty in this process, although it was not the only one in Anatolia, were the Seljuks of Rum. Initially, a rather minor and peripheral Muslim power who are poorly recorded in the sources in the 11th and 12th century. But by the 13th century, had become a major Middle Eastern and Mediterranean power, bolstered by the wealth of their newly opened silver mines and by their control of strategically important trade routes. Now, despite considerable attention by generations of scholars to the political history of Seljuk Anatolia and its artistic and architectural legacy, much less attention has been devoted to its intellectual culture, which remains largely unknown even to specialists. And despite a plethora of extant texts from the period, largely in Arabic and Persian, pre-Ottoman Anatolia is often dismissed as having a rather sparse source base. And this is due to the fact that most of these Arabic and Persian texts remain unpublished in manuscript form. So I've tried to address some aspects of this problem in my recent book, Islam, Literature and Society in Mongol Anatolia, which was published in 2019, which seeks to use the extant manuscript evidence to understand the process of religious change, especially in the later 13th and early 14th centuries. But the intellectual production of the period also needs evaluating in its own terms, with a view to understanding not just what texts can tell us about our own modern historical questions, but also why these texts were written in the first place, by whom and for whom. And it's clear that the patronage of the Seljuk court played a major role in the emergence of a literary culture in Arabic and Persian, but major questions remain unanswered and indeed rarely posed. What texts did the court commission? How do these types of literature compare with those read in other Muslim states of the period, for example, that of the Ayyubids in Syria? And is there a distinctively Anatolian textual and literary culture, or should it be seen as the wholesale importation of outside intellectual models? What role do texts and writers play in supporting the political ambitions of the ruling dynasty? And these questions in turn force us to ask other broader ones that make us rethink the fundamentals of how court and society function in the period. Who actually is the audience for Arabic and Persian texts in medieval Anatolia? And should we think of them as being addressed to a small courtly elite alone, or did they in some form circulate more widely amongst the population? So what's the relationship between courtly culture and that of society more generally? And these questions can be addressed through the ownership, sale, and copying notes on manuscripts, which form a vital and underutilized source for the circulation of text, and thus as a window into intellectual life more generally. So in the research project I'm going to be undertaking at ANAMED, my research will focus on the period between circa 1170, which is roughly when our first written manuscripts from Anatolia, Muslim Anatolia, survive. So between about 1170 and 1280. This period has a rather different character to the post-1280 period, which formed the focus of my earlier bit, when Mongol domination in Anatolia tightened and the Seljuk Sultanate was reduced to impotence before its final disappearance in the early 14th century. This is the period when the earliest Muslim literary texts from Anatolia start to be produced in the late 12th century. And for the next century, the Seljuk court plays the leading role in the patronage of literary culture, which is supplanted by other centres after 1280. So this is really the foundational period for the emergence of a Muslim intellectual and literary culture in Anatolia, largely, not entirely, expressed in Arabic and Persian. Yet with the exception of the works of the famous Jalaluddin Rumi, of Konya, almost none of its literary production has been seriously studied today. My research in Istanbul aims to focus on a variety of manuscripts, predominantly housed in the Süleymaniye Library, but also in other libraries such as the Topkapı and others, including mirrors for princes or works of political advice written for the Sultan, esoteric texts, religious texts patronized by the court, and philosophical texts, of which there were a number written for the Seljuks of Anatolia. And taken together, the investigation of these texts promised to move on our understanding of medieval Anatolian intellectual culture beyond the scant corpus of a handful of chronicles which have formed the focus of research to date. And this work will form the basis of a monograph, and hopefully the experience of researching these texts firsthand in Istanbul, thanks to the fellowship at ANAMED, will be an invaluable contribution to collecting the necessary research materials for this project, which I hope will transform our understanding of the early years of Muslim intellectual culture in Anatolia. Thank you.